EA have gotten a lot of things wrong from the players' perspectives with their business model and approach to the gaming industry over the years, where their reputation has suffered, though sadly that hasn't been reflective of their profits. Amongst all of the egregious practices around monetization and advertising, there are some gems in their catalogue that should be praised. Releases that have clearly had their development teams flex their creativity and craftsmanship to produce a product that has a meaningful and positive impact on the games industry. Dead Space is one of those games, and based on comments seen online around this game's lack of sales, this is likely one of the best games that you decided to skip. Dead Space 2023 is a remake of the 2008 survival horror game of the same name. Being made by the Canadian-based Motive Studio, with some of the original development team of the initial series, this title marks the first game in the Dead Space franchise since the release of Dead Space 3 in 2013. This remake possibly goes that little bit further when comparing to all of the remakes, in that not only is the story expanded upon in some ways from the original, but the main protagonist and general storyline throughout the game are now more fully fleshed out in comparison to that original release. I should note that I'll be discussing this game from the perspective of a complete newcomer to the series. Although I was aware of what Dead Space was prior to playing this, I have never actually played more than a few minutes of any of the original games. The Dead Space IP is one of the few survival horror franchises that has its origins so late in gaming history, with its initial release on the 7th generation consoles, and doing so well in the survival horror space that it allows its popularity to live on even today. This franchise has been quoted by its initial creators as being the Resident Evil in space, and although that is a good analogy to make for understanding that this game has elements of both survival and horror, in my opinion, this remake does far more with a horror element than any of the Resident Evil games that I have played. Based in the 26th century, you'll be playing as Isaac Clarke, a starship engineer who is part of the repair vessel known as the Kellion. The team aboard the Kellion are responding to a distress signal for the USG Ishimura, which is a planetary mining ship. However, things take a turn for the worse as the crew are attacked by creatures that look to be mutated from humans that we come to know as necromorphs. From the game's over-the-shoulder third-person perspective, you'll be navigating your way through various missions across the Ishimura with your aim to learn exactly what is going on and to repair what you can of the ship, with the end goal being to survive this hellish nightmare. Isaac Clarke is no soldier, so most of the tools that you'll be dealing with these horrors are exactly that, 26th century mining tools that you'll be utilising to dispatch your enemies and relieve them of their limbs. The focus on this game, right from the outset, is player immersion, especially when it comes to the act of playing on your senses of claustrophobia, awareness, and if I may say so, genuine fear, all of which it succeeds in doing through nearly every moment of gameplay. There are a few times during the playthrough of this whole game that control is taken away from the player, and so the sense of anything can happen at any point in which you need to react is consistent right through the experience. And I'll say early on that this game for me at first was quite mentally and physically draining to play as compared to the recent Resident Evil 4 remake that I didn't play too long before originally starting this game. Resident Evil as a franchise, but more specifically that remake, is so much more action based than this, and I think I was a little taken back initially about how much harder it leans into the horror element than any of the Resident Evil games these days dares to go near. This capture and overall review have been carried out using a PS5 copy of the game, and I will feature some minor early story spoilers and pretty much everything that was seen within the trailers. The game structure is quite an interesting one to try and explain. The original release, as I understand it, was much more segmented in its approach to the range of missions that this game takes you through. As you progress through, there are points throughout that see the chapter change on screen relative to the narrative that's taking place at the time. Though this game does give you a certain sense of freedom with exploring the Ishimura's areas once you've reached them, there are a specific set of objectives to meet in them to open up all of the sections within those areas, in which along the way you'll be fighting enemies, collecting resources and weapons to survive, and piecing together the story of the Ishimura by collecting audio and text logs, as well as taking in the scenery, which often tells you a whole horror story by itself. Balancing all of that does give a well-paced playthrough, and it never really feels like a stale formula at any point, and although my comments on the original design are limited, I can safely say that the more open-ended style gameplay here no doubt allows for a fuller sense of exploration and overall tension right the way throughout. The general gist of progression for Isaac is that you'll be aiming to fix the ship's many functions, in which its problems feel like a sort of whack-a-mole, as Isaac will fix one thing and then something else will be broken, which you'll also need to attend. It's through that narrative arc that you'll begin to learn more about what is happening aboard the ship and come into contact with both necromorphs and survivors alike. The gameplay loop and shooter mechanics are familiar, but also feel quite different to that of a normal survival horror game, in that the aim here is to dismember your enemies as much as possible to both stop them approaching you and kill them the quickest. Headshots are not the aim. That goal makes the gunplay, or tool play, feels so much more satisfying than a lot of shooters, especially when you get to grips with the weapon systems in place. It's for this reason that Isaac's toolset that he manages to find aboard the ship becomes one of the game's most takeaway features. You'll be finding and utilising a weapon set that almost configures like a sort of toolbox for dealing with certain problems, one that is almost designed to be experimented with by the player. For me specifically, if I happen to have sliced a necromorph's legs from their body, they'll still be coming at you, and hitting their arms with the same angle can prove tricky. Changing the angle of the tool allows you to change the direction of the slice for their arms. Likewise, if you have one of these large looking necromorphs coming for you, you'll not want to hit their stomach, which will spawn more foes, and ensure that you use something like a flamethrower to take them down. This balance of choosing the right weapon for the job is an enjoyable one, and it does make things interesting, and dare I say gives an adrenaline rush when you're running low on an ammo type that you so heavily depend on. I like the game's ability to making you switch weapon, as it does give you a chance to experiment a little with the arsenal available to you. Throughout the playthrough, you'll find many points in which you'll have access to the game's upgrade and shop systems that allow you to increase basic stats on both your weapons and suit, as well as adding additional special stat abilities to make both of them a little bit more useful. It's in those same sort of areas that you'll find this game's save points, which it does encourage you to use as often as possible, as this will basically be your checkpoint system all the way. I do wish the save points weren't utilised in that way, as it can make things feel a little stop-start when you're reaching those save points every 10 to 15 minutes. Due to those upgrading shop systems, you'll be spending much of your time in a desperate attempt to locate the relevant resources for them, as you'll be needing everything that you can to tip the combat scales in your favour. The enemies are often easy enough to deal with once you learn their quirks, but this game aims to make you panic as much as possible during the surprise encounters that happen. And if you're caught off guard with the wrong weapon selected for use, the enemies can and will overcome you quite quickly. The upgrade system can feel a little slow in its progression at first, especially if you're varying your upgrades across all of the weapons and suit types, but the abilities that you unlock as you progress further into the trees do make quite a difference in the late game and in New Game Plus. There are a bunch of weapons, all with their purpose as you play throughout, but my personal experience for utilising all of them is that I found trying to tailor my equipped weapons with a balance of those that I had the most ammo for, and keeping a variety of long and shorter range options available for use. You'll learn quickly that every time you shoot counts, and any bullet from the wrong tool is better than no bullet from any tool. The scares throughout this game don't really originate too many times from jump scares, although there are some. It's more in the constant tension and nervousness that you'll feel walking down some of the darkest spaces I've ever seen in video games. Most of the enemies will approach at a moderate pace, so it never really feels unfair that you're being rushed, but it does get claustrophobic quite quickly when you can see 3 enemies all running at you and you're undecided which one to take down first. The tension throughout is not helped by the game's AI director having free reign to deploy enemies' spawns at random, even through areas that you've cleared before, making for a difficult time to relax when you know the map well enough. This game isn't really for the faint of heart. One place where you can relax is this game's sort of hub area, and acts as a bridge more between the main sections, that being the tram. You'll get access to the tram quite early on, and it very much becomes a sort of location of a respite, as to my knowledge and experience no enemy spawns seem to occur here. As I mentioned earlier, you'll be progressing through the ship to reach certain segments elements, and it's in this tram that it'll become your main point of entry for each of them, usually with a chapter starting on the tram platform. I treated this tram location very much like the save rooms from the Resident Evil game, for example, just as a moment to try and catch your breath. In addition to the combat and resource collection, you'll also be figuring out a range of puzzles where the ship repairs are needed, in which you'll heavily utilise Isaac's other skills of anti-gravity navigation and kinesis. All of those are quite simple logical puzzles, in which you'll be working out how to move something to the right spot using your kinesis, or to reach a location to interact with a specific object. All the puzzles that you interact with are quite varied, and the room design of each of them is pretty unique, and you'll never really feel like you're doing the same thing twice, or if you are, it's usually a more advanced version of what you did the first time. Those puzzles are very often interrupted by necromorphs, so even this is usually a moment to be on your toes. That brings me to this game's versions of boss fights, which again act more like puzzles than they do using just brute force against them. You'll be working out weak points or aiming to utilise certain environmental elements against them to take them down. They are all obvious on what you need to do with them to finish them off, and none of them are really the highlight of the game in any way that I would say, although the hunter enemy type can be an interesting foe when you do first meet him. The boss fights never really feel like boss fights in a traditional sense, in my opinion, and that's kind of why I like them. The transition into them from regular gameplay is smooth, and the fact that the control is never really taken away from the player when moving into them makes it feel more surprising to you as the player. You're now having to deal with this very massive problem more or less immediately. Given there is so much emphasis placed on the resource gathering and exploration through the vast darkness of the Ishimura, I can only emphasise the importance in this experience around the game's constant use of unsettling and foreboding sound design. As you're slowly making your way from room to room searching for cash and supplies, you'll constantly be hounded from the dark by screams of the unlucky survivors of the Ishimura, and it's so subtle sometimes that it makes you check over your shoulder to see if something is coming. Paired with the game's chilling music, it all makes for an atmosphere of relentless tension. I wouldn't describe the game as difficult. It is in no way a walk in the park either. Your senses will be tested, and your reactions will rely on your ability to remain calm. Visually, you can likely tell from the gameplay that although this is a dark game, its graphical fidelity is up there with some of the best AAA games going. The Frostbite engine in use offers some truly striking visuals in the game's metallic and grungy aesthetic. The enemy design from a visual perspective is also extremely gruesome and gory, especially with some of the flesh loss and bone breaking systems that you can see in place, all of which makes for many times that you'll be kind of taken back by what the technology can actually show. Something I haven't really said at all in this review so far is the word fun. The reason for that is, although that I got embedded into this game's systems and themes, the fun doesn't really pick up until later in the game. At first, there are some hurdles for me to get over. Especially, as I said before, when coming in from playing that Resident Evil 4 remake so close to this. I started this game initially completing the first 2 chapters, and for one reason or the other, I ended up pushing playing the rest back in my mind for a good couple of months. And I think that was down to the initial experience of just feeling so draining, where the gameplay takes it out of you with being so on edge all the time. This could just be me and my own sensibilities, but I did feel a struggle to get into it at first. Although, after going back to it and really playing through it properly, that feeling did drift away. So yes, I do think this game is a fun game, as well as being horror-filled when all is said and done. In summary for the gameplay, if you're a horror fan, don't really think you should have ever skipped this game if you did. If you're a fan of Resident Evil like me, it is a change, but such a welcome one if you're able to get through that initial barrier of constant tension that Resident Evil games just doesn't really have these days. It is, without doubt, a nerve-wracking experience to go through. But even so, I really enjoyed my time getting through this, and even more so when going for that shiny platinum trophy and really learning the game. If you've ever thought about playing this, do yourself a favour and commit. As I said before, this franchise isn't something that I've been overly familiar with through the years. With it being a franchise in the first place, that of course comes with a large set of media around the history of the IP, in which it's released several games, comics, novels, and I think even a couple of animated films. So the lore here does have some great depth to it. You'll get a feel for this with the in-game collectibles that you can find. Though I do think that they sometimes fall to that standard trope of just being large blocks of text that usually have some sort of facts that, unless you've watched some sort of online YouTube videos or know a little bit more about the lore anyway, you'll probably struggle to understand in any great depth. With all that being the case, Some people, I have no doubt, are going to be engrossed in this universe, and I can see the appeal from an overall perspective why it might be interesting to some. But looking at this game just on its own merits, I don't think the story is something that spoke to me personally. I know that the game's narrative is more in-depth than the original. I can tell that so much went into the writing and the acting craft for these characters. It's just that even after playing for around 20 hours, I never really cared that much about Isaac or any of the supporting characters. This may have a lot to do with the fact that this game doesn't really have any cutscenes per se. As I've said multiple times already, control is very rarely taken away from the player, even during the sections where the narrative takes centre stage. It will often be that you're maybe in a locked space looking for a glass window to see some sort of event unfold. For me, being so into gaming overall because of Hideo Kojima and the Metal Gear Solid series, this is a completely different direction that I do understand from a gameplay perspective in that it makes things feel a lot more immersive, but I just don't personally gel that well with that style of storytelling. I much prefer front and centre than that looking through the glass narrative. Cutscenes have always been for me a moment to relax and enjoy the story that's unfolding. In Dead Space, those moments don't really deliver in the same way to me. Outside of that personal preference, I also don't think that there is much substance to the story for Isaac directly. The reason being that outside of him fixing the ship and trying to find someone on the ship, his motivation's a little else, and so the entire time you're playing, you're only really seeing a single narrative beat play out for Isaac. But all of that being said, this game's environmental storytelling is a different conversation. As you wander around the Ishimura, you'll be presented with these horrific events that have been unfolding on the ship, and it's in the design of those levels that you'll start to piece together bits of the lore and, more importantly, of the terror that's been unleashed upon the ship's residents. This serves two purposes really. The first is that it gives you a sense of exploration and discovery through each room you go through, as even the smallest spaces can tell part of a story by some writing on the wall or some blood across the floor. The second is adding to that sense of unease that something bad happened here, and the opportunity for it to happen again is likely just around the corner. Combining all the storytelling elements together does make for a compelling argument the story is worth paying attention to. I just believe that some people will appreciate it far more than others, likely driven by the fascination with the backstory lore more than the events unfolding before the play. The narrative side of things is a solid experience, and the story is one that's easy to follow throughout, though I do think as things start to unfold to the bigger picture towards the end, as opposed to just Isaac Clarke's personal experience in this ordeal, all of the environmental aspects up to that point begin to make more sense in their own right, and for that reason creates a better sense of resolution than the game's initial main story focus. Those who are seeking the full completion and acquiring that platinum trophy or the 1000 game score shouldn't have too many problems in doing so, though they will have to dedicate a certain amount of time to being able to learn the game very well. For the most part, a good many trophies that are more in depth are related to completing all of the available side quests that ask you to do a varying small amount of tasks associated to them. There are also a range of trophies for killing enemies in a certain number of times, but you'll likely get those on your first playthrough. You'll be playing this game for a minimum of 3 times. The first being the most natural playthrough, the second a new game plus that allows you to collect some new artifacts in the game and unlock the remake's alternate ending, and the final and third time is to play through on the impossible difficulty. The only one of those with any real challenge to them is that impossible difficulty playthrough. Even during the impossible playthrough, you'll have learned the game well enough to know what to expect. This difficulty and its related trophies add the complication that if you die, you start all over again from the beginning of the game. There are a few ways to get around this complete failure aspect, by either quitting out just before you die or utilising save scumming tools such as PlayStation Plus's online upload if you want to go that way. All the previous tension and horror elements will have dissipated by these points, but fear not, as the anxiety of permadeath does take over. The overall game is equivalent to hard here, so if you've played already on that, you should feel quite familiar. Just know that this cannot be completed on a new game plus to make you feel that bit more esteemed should you manage to get through it. This isn't the easiest platinum trophy, but with the amount of strategies and tips and tricks online to help you through a playthrough, it is quite achievable for most people. The only real annoyance that I faced in the whole game was the amount of backtracking that you have to do when doing the collectibles, and if you're doing them blindly like I did, you'll be checking your map or checking the waypoint system quite often, both of which have a small delay each time you press the button, and although it's not a big one, I did start to wish that that wasn't the case. I titled this video as the horror game that you should not have skipped. The main reason being is that the apparent poor sales for the game likely means that we won't expect to see its hoped for sequel anytime soon. And although I don't think the story landed for me, I do believe that this game deserves more time in the spotlight than it has had so far. If you're a fan of horror games at any level, this is something that you should certainly endeavour to play at least once. Though I don't think impossible difficulty is going to be for everyone, the game's achievements in relentless tension building and overall approach to making the player feel so immersed in this twisted setting is worth the recommendation to play it. It has been a while since originally released, so you'll more or likely be able to find this on some sort of discount or sale at this point, and I likely would have recommended this at full price given the game length and content on offer. Not to mention that it almost ticks every box in what it sets out to do. I hope that we see one day a scenario in which EA do give another chance on Dead Space as a franchise, as this remake proves that there is life in the franchise and its existence acts as another beacon of light in the EA game library. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch this review. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please consider subscribing to the channel as I'll be doing more reviews and discussions, and if you have any thoughts on the videos, please feel free to comment below as I'd like to make these both as entertaining and helpful as possible. Up until now I've been getting to grips with putting these videos together and getting a better understanding and feel for editing. Going forward I'm hoping to begin focusing on more on current games in terms of release date, though I will be tailoring my discussion videos to a broader conversation topic. Let me know in the comments if there's any releases that you're looking forward to, as I'm always looking for what to play next myself. My name is Liquidizer, it's been a pleasure, and I hope to see you again real soon.